There comes a moment in every connection when the more you lean in, the more the other person leans out. You offer understanding, patience, generosity, and yet somehow, the more you give, the less you are seen. We often imagine that closeness is created by effort, by showing how deeply we care, by proving our loyalty. But relationships don't breathe in that space, they suffocate there. Respect doesn't grow where one person is endlessly available. Respect grows in the space where two people can feel each other's energy without one person carrying the weight of both. Detachment isn't about cutting someone out of your life or becoming cold, it is the quiet inner decision to stop over-functioning in a dynamic that has stopped nourishing you. Many people misunderstand detachment as an act of emotional distance or indifference, but in reality it is a return to equilibrium. When you are overly invested, you begin to take responsibility for emotions that aren't yours, needs that aren't being reciprocated, and outcomes that you cannot control. This creates a subtle tension within you, an anxious desire to fix, to persuade, to manage the connection so it doesn't slip away. But the irony is that the more you lean forward, the more the other person often leans back. Emotional overextension sends an unspoken message that you are willing to sacrifice your own boundaries to maintain closeness, and this often invites imbalance rather than intimacy. Detachment interrupts this pattern. It is the moment you withdraw your energy from trying to orchestrate harmony and redirect it back into yourself. You stop chasing clarity and instead allow space to reveal truth. Detachment doesn't ask you to stop caring, it asks you to stop negotiating your worth. When you detach, your energy shifts. You're no longer acting from fear of loss but from the awareness that love, respect, and connection must be mutual. This shift is palpable, it changes the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you show up. You don't plead for attention, you don't push for reassurance, and you don't contort yourself to keep someone comfortable. You simply allow things to unfold without forcing them. In that space, emotional autonomy becomes a form of quiet confidence. You reclaim the parts of yourself that were diluted by overgiving. You make choices from groundedness instead of urgency. You express needs without desperation. You stop absorbing emotional labor that isn't yours. And as you do this, the dynamic around you naturally begins to reorganize. Some people step forward because they finally feel the absence of your constant giving. Others fall away because the relationship was sustained by your over-effort. Either way, detachment reveals what is real. It frees you from the illusion that connection is something you can hold together through sheer will. It allows you to witness the relationship without the fog of emotional overinvestment. And it returns you to a state where your value is not dependent on how much you can endure or sacrifice but on how authentically you can remain yourself without bending to preserve someone else's comfort. Respect is not something you convince someone to give you. It is something they naturally feel when your boundaries speak for you louder than your explanations ever could. When you maintain firm, consistent limits, not in anger, not in punishment, but in clarity, you communicate your self-worth without uttering a single persuasive word. Boundaries are the architecture of healthy connection, and they are often most visible not in what you say but in what you no longer tolerate. When your actions align with your standards, you create a framework in which respect can grow. This is because people don't respond to what you request, they respond to what you reinforce. If you continue showing up in spaces that diminish you, if you continue investing in someone who gives you only fragments of themselves, you inadvertently teach them that this behavior is acceptable. But when you step back, when you refuse to engage in dynamics that drain you, when you decline to over-explain your feelings just to be heard, you send an entirely different message, one that is felt rather than argued. Consistency is the backbone of boundaries. A boundary that fluctuates based on your emotions, fears, or desire for approval loses its power. When you state a limit and then bend it at the slightest discomfort, you teach the other person that your words are flexible and your needs are negotiable. But when your boundaries remain steady, even when it's hard, even when you fear losing the connection, you cultivate a deeper kind of respect. People may resist boundaries at first, especially if they benefited from your lack of them, but they eventually adjust to the new emotional ecosystem you create through your consistency. By holding your limits calmly and confidently, you shift the relational dynamic from one of imbalance to one of reciprocity. You stop managing other people's emotions and start taking responsibility for your own. Boundaries communicated through action also carry a unique power because they bypass defensiveness. When you don't engage in an argument, when you don't plead for better behavior, when you simply withdraw from situations that don't honor you, you allow the other person to feel the natural consequences of their choices. You stop trying to teach them how to treat you and instead demonstrate it through the space you create. This kind of communication is unmistakably clear. It doesn't rely on emotional intensity or repeated warnings. It is the quiet but firm declaration that your self-respect is non-negotiable. And in that clarity, in that unwavering steadiness, respect is not demanded, it emerges naturally as the only appropriate response to the way you honor yourself. When you step back from a dynamic where you have been over-functioning, you interrupt a pattern that may have been silently shaping the entire relationship. Many relationships fall into unspoken roles. One person becomes the emotional caretaker, the planner, the mediator, the one who senses needs and fills them before they're even articulated, while the other becomes increasingly passive, relying on that steady flow of energy without realizing how much they are receiving. When you detach, you remove yourself from this invisible labor, and suddenly, the balance that once felt natural reveals itself as heavily skewed. This disruption is not an act of spite, it is a necessary recalibration. It forces the other person to confront their own participation in the relationship and to recognize the gap your presence was quietly filling. People rarely see imbalance while they are benefiting from it. But the moment you stop cushioning every conflict, managing every emotional shift, or making every effort to maintain closeness, the other person is left to feel the weight of their own contributions. In that space, they begin to experience the absence of what they had taken for granted. Detachment isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or make grand declarations. It simply withdraws the energy that was holding a pattern together, allowing what is dysfunctional to collapse under its own weight. This creates an opportunity for the relationship to reorganize itself on more equal terms. Some people rise to the occasion. They adjust, they initiate, they reciprocate because they finally sense the value of what they were receiving. Others withdraw further, revealing that their investment was conditional on your over-effort. Either way, the truth becomes unmistakably clear. Detachment invites reciprocity because it places responsibility back where it belongs. When you stop anticipating every need, the other person must decide whether they want to step in or step away. The dynamic is no longer powered by your willingness to compensate for their emotional inaction. You give them the space to choose, and their choice becomes a reflection of their true intentions rather than your continuous efforts. This shift also liberates you from the emotional exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of two people's desires. You begin to trust that healthy connection does not require constant managing, it requires balance. Detachment allows you to observe the relationship without the distortions of fear or attachment. You see what is genuinely mutual, what is stagnant, and what is built on your habit of giving more than you receive. And in that clarity, the relationship either transforms through renewed effort and respect, or it naturally fades, making room for something healthier to grow. There is a profound shift that happens when you stop trying to convince someone of your worth and allow your absence, your silence, and your self-possession to communicate what words never could. Many people spend vast emotional energy explaining themselves, defending their intentions, or trying to highlight the value they bring to a relationship. But the truth is, the more you try to prove yourself, the more you unintentionally signal that your value is conditional on someone else's recognition. When you detach, you stop performing. You stop auditioning for a role in someone's life. You stop offering endless reassurance just to maintain your place. Instead, you let your presence become something felt rather than negotiated. Silence has a way of revealing dynamics that conversation often obscures. When you step back, the other person suddenly becomes aware of how much space you filled without demanding acknowledgement. They feel the quiet where your emotional attentiveness used to be. They notice the absence of your constant effort, your thoughtful gestures, your ability to bring steadiness to moments of uncertainty. This isn't about withholding, it's about allowing the natural consequences of your emotional labor to become visible. When you no longer rush to fill every gap, the emptiness speaks for you. It shows the other person what your presence had been providing all along. People often see your value most clearly when they are left alone with the space you once filled. This is not a tactic but a truth of human psychology. Familiarity blinds us, while distance sharpens our vision. When you detach, you create a shift in perspective. Instead of focusing on what you are giving, the other person begins to notice what they lost access to. And this recognition doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from contrast. It comes from feeling the difference between a dynamic fueled by your constant effort and a dynamic where they must show up with their own. Detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It communicates that your worth does not need to be advertised. It is felt intuitively when you are no longer trying to earn affection through performance. By not forcing conversations, not chasing closure, and not demanding validation, you allow the truth to rise organically. The other person begins to see the relationship in its real proportions. They recognize the balance or imbalance that your effort had been masking. And in that quiet realization, respect begins to grow, not because you insisted on it, but because your restraint, your composure, and your willingness to step back reveal a depth of self-worth that demands acknowledgement without ever asking for it. Detachment reshapes the emotional landscape of a relationship because it shifts the center of gravity from needing someone's validation to honoring your own inner stability. When you stop chasing reassurance, stop over-explaining your feelings, and stop making yourself smaller just to maintain peace, you naturally become the one who sets the tone of the connection. This isn't dominance or control, it's alignment. You are no longer reacting to someone else's moods, decisions, or inconsistencies. Instead, you begin moving from a grounded, intentional place within yourself. Your energy becomes less about seeking and more about choosing. You choose where to invest, how to respond, and what you will or will not accept. This subtle shift is powerful because it signals that your emotional world is self-sustaining, not dependent on someone else's approval. When you detach, you stop allowing external behavior to dictate your internal experience. You no longer spiral when someone pulls away or becomes distant. You no longer feel compelled to fix situations that were never yours to fix. You become more observant and less reactive, allowing you to see things with clarity rather than fear. And in that clarity, your decisions become stronger. You're able to walk away from dishonor without collapsing, and you're able to stay present in healthy dynamics without losing yourself. This emotional sovereignty transforms how others experience you. People feel the difference between someone who needs connection to feel whole and someone who welcomes connection from a place of self-respect. The latter naturally commands more respect, not through force, but through presence. Detachment also invites a new kind of interaction, one where the other person must show up authentically because you're no longer cushioning the dynamic with over-effort. They feel your steadiness. They sense that your peace is not negotiable. They recognize that your boundaries are not threats but truths. And this often inspires them to adjust, to rise, to match the energy you bring. You become a mirror, reflecting what a balanced connection could look like without carrying the emotional labor on your own shoulders. The tone you set becomes the emotional climate of the relationship. If you move with calm, the dynamic becomes calmer. If you move with intention, the dynamic becomes more intentional. If you move with self-respect, the dynamic either meets that standard or naturally falls away. Ultimately, detachment frees you from the exhausting role of being the emotional anchor for two people. It allows you to stand firm in your own value, making the relationship a choice rather than an emotional dependency. And in that space, respect becomes the natural outcome of how courageously you hold yourself, how clearly you honor your needs, and how confidently you allow whatever is real to reveal itself through action rather than effort.